Rain, a voice trembling, choking back tears.
Driver, step out of the vehicle. Face away from us.
So, what tragedy happened to the little girl that shocked the United States in 2013? Let's follow crime cases to find out the truth of the story. Background and family turmoil. Cherish Perrywinkle was an 8-year-old girl born into a troubled family in Jacksonville, Florida. Her mother, Rain Perrywinkle, whose birth name was Kimberly Hoy, originally from Brisbane, author with a complicated past who moved to the United States and changed her name. Rain had 3 daughters in total: Lindsay Hoy, her eldest, who lived in Australia, Cherish Perrywinkle, the tragic young girl at the center of this case, and 2 younger half-sisters, Destiny and Neve, who lived with Rain in Florida before the tragedy. Cherish's biological father, Billy Gerard, was a sailor living in California and was only confirmed to be her father after a court-ordered DNA test 3 years after her birth. The relationship between Rain and Billy was fraught with tension and conflict, especially over custody, parenting styles, and financial issues. Despite Billy's repeated attempts to gain custody, due to concerns about Cherish's living conditions, Cherish remained in Florida with her mother and her sisters. Rain's family struggled with financial instability and psychological challenges. She had a history of mental health issues and was deemed unstable as a caregiver. Rain's boyfriend also had a history of substance abuse and domestic violence, contributing to an unsafe and unstable environment for the children. All these factors laid a difficult foundation for Cherish's life, setting the stage for the tragic events that followed. The day of the tragedy. It was early evening on June 21, 2013, in Jacksonville, Florida. Rain Perrywinkle, a mother struggling to make ends meet, gathered her 3 young daughters for what she hoped would be a simple shopping trip. The oldest, Cherish, was just 8 years old, full of life and excitement for the summer ahead. She was about to visit her father in California, and Rain wanted to get her a few new clothes before the trip. The family had little money. Rain's boyfriend had given her $100, but she needed to stretch it carefully: new clothes for Cherish, essentials for the household, and a taxi fare to the airport early the next morning. With a stroller for the youngest and her hands full, Rain set off on the 20-minute walk to Dollar General. As they approached the store, Rain couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She noticed a man nearby, Donald Smith, a man in his late 50s with white hair and cold eyes that seemed to watch her and the girls a little too closely. He wasn't a stranger to the store. She had seen him around before but never spoke with him. Now, he was standing just inside the doorway, his gaze fixed on her family. Rain tried to focus on the task, buying what she could with the limited cash, but Donald's presence lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She felt him watching her like a hawk, waiting for a moment to strike. Then, he made his move. He approached Rain quietly, offering help. He claimed to have a $150 Walmart gift card and said his wife was on her way to meet them there. He spoke softly but with an insistence that left little room for refusal. "You look like you have your hands full," he said. "I have kids too." Rain, exhausted and desperate, allowed herself to believe him. The promise of help was too tempting to ignore. She hesitated, but the rain began to fall hard, and with no working phone, her youngest had accidentally damaged it earlier. There was no easy way out, so she agreed to get into the van with Donald and her daughters. The van was unsettling white with curtains on the windows, an empty middle seat, and the passenger seat pushed all the way forward. But Rain told herself to trust. He said she was safe. And for a moment, that was enough. They drove to Walmart, a 10-minute trip that felt like a lifetime. Inside, Donald didn't shop. Instead, he watched, hovering around Rain and the girls as they picked through the aisles. At one point, he added a coil of rope to their cart, a detail that seemed innocuous, then but would later haunt the memories of all involved. As the store began to close, the children grew restless and hungry. Donald suggested McDonald's inside the Walmart for a quick meal. Cherish eagerly followed him towards the restaurant alone. No screams, no protests. Just the trust of a little girl who believed in the safety her mother had felt just hours before. That was the last time Rain saw her daughter alive. The night was closing in. Cherish Perrywinkle, a bright-eyed 8-year-old, was last seen skipping happily toward the McDonald's inside Walmart, following Donald Smith, a man her mother had just met hours before. But the McDonald's was closed. No one inside Walmart realized the terrifying truth that Cherish had vanished. Inside the store, Rain Perrywinkle wandered anxiously, pushing a cart filled with items she hoped to buy for her family. Minutes turned to half an hour, then to nearly an hour. Cherish was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. Rain's heart hammered in her chest as she called out, screamed for help. She ran through the aisles, checked the dressing rooms, the bathrooms, any place a frightened child might hide, but there was no sign of her daughter. Her own phone was broken, making it impossible to call for help right away. She borrowed a phone from an employee and dialed 911.
911 Robinson.
Hi, that Walmart. I went to her. I think my daughter's been taken.
What do you mean?
Taken by a stranger. I can't find her. I met a man today at Dollar General. He saw that I was struggling to buy them some clothes. He drove us here to buy us some clothes, and the only reason I went with him because she said his wife was going to be here.
Okay, and she was last seen with this man?
Yes, he said he was going to McDonald's, and he hasn't been there because the store is closed right now. I had a bad feeling about him.
Okay, how long have you been looking for you? When was the last time you saw your daughter? How long ago?
About half an hour ago.
Okay, ma'am. What's your daughter's name?
Her name's Cherish.
And her last name?
Perrywinkle with a P. I had a strange feeling about him when I first met him, and he took her to the dressing room twice, and I was hoping that she would be okay. And I was looking at the shoes, and I didn't want him to think that I was overly protective. I had a bad feeling. I thought, well, I feel like pinching myself because this is too good to be true. He was giving my 8-year-old too much attention. He wanted her to buy these really tall shoes that were women's shoes, and I told him no. I don't want him to kill her. I should have told him no.
The 911 operator tried to calm her, asking for details. But Rain had only fragments to offer a description of Donald Smith, a white hair driving a white van with curtains on the windows. She confessed to a bad feeling she had when she first met him. Security footage soon revealed the chilling truth: Donald had followed Rain and her children, paying particular attention to Cherish. Cameras caught Donald and Cherish leaving the store, calmly walking through the parking lot, then getting into the van and driving away at 11:36 p.m. The police broadcasted be on the lookout for Cherish and the van in 1998 white Dodge. And by midnight to be on the lookout had spread throughout Nassau County. An air unit was called out, too, and police units were all over the Dollar General store and Walmart. Motel and hotels were being searched, and authorities were sent to addresses of known sex offenders in the area. Yet, despite the urgency, the police response was slow. The case was initially treated as a missing person report rather than a confirmed abduction. An Amber Alert, a crucial tool for saving abducted children, wasn't issued. Precious time slipped away. At 3:30 a.m., they named their suspect, 56-year-old Donald J. Smith, a registered sex offender. Statistically, authorities knew that time was really not on their side, and they brought homicide detectives onto the case. At 4:00 a.m., the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally sent out an Amber Alert. And just before 7, Child Abduction Response Team, known as CRT, or CART, was requested to be activated by homicide detectives, and the offender tracking unit was called out, too.
Hi, we're calling about a suspicious van over here, a white van.
Thanks to a call from someone watching the news, they were able to track down the van.
720. Yeah, 720.
It was like that. We
We didn't know anything until just now. It's not there anymore, but we don't know if he dumped anything because we heard a girl just got abducted from Walmart.
All right, and you said it's now gone?
Yes, ma'am.
But you think he may have, just in case, he might have dumped something?
Right, we don't know, but just in case, it looked suspicious because it was all the way to the back.
And finally, at 9:00 a.m., officers caught up with Donald. But Cherish was nowhere to be seen.
Keep your hands in the air. Stop.
Donald didn't say a word, but his face said everything. The expression he gave confirmed Wilkie's gut feeling, and there was no need for further denial. Acting swiftly, officers returned to the area where a witness had earlier reported seeing the white van parked behind a church. There, just 20 minutes after Donald's arrest, they searched a nearby creek behind the church. It was there that they found the lifeless body of 8-year-old Cherish Perrywinkle. She was lying on her side at the edge of the water, her long hair drifting in the current, and the bright floral dress she had been wearing was found nearby. Tire tracks in the area matched the van. The discovery confirmed their worst fears. Cherish had been murdered, and Donald Smith was responsible. The vanishing light, what came next? The morning air in Jacksonville had turned heavy thick with dread and disbelief. As the sun broke through the clouds on June 22, 2013, police officers stood in stunned silence at the edge of the shallow creek behind a quiet, nondescript church. And there, floating partially in the water, was the small, broken body of Cherish Perrywinkle. Her once bright floral dress lay nearby, soaked and stained, a haunting echo of the innocence that had been so brutally taken. Her long hair fanned out gently in the current, like a ribbon waving goodbye to a world that had failed to protect her. What followed was a grim ritual of truth. The officers called in medical examiners. The crime scene was sealed. And the realization set in. This was no longer a search for a missing child. This was now a murder investigation. Back at the station, Donald Smith sat alone in an interrogation room, silent, motionless, and almost bored. Surveillance footage showed him leaning back in the chair, at one point even dozing off, as if nothing had happened. There was no panic, no remorse, just cold detachment. When detectives finally entered and read him his rights, he refused to speak.
You do answer questions, you have the right to stop answering questions at any time. Consult a lawyer, you understand that? This is an investigation of the abduction and murder of a
Cherish Perrywinkle.
8-year-old female. We'd like to ask you questions about it. You want to talk to us?
Charlie Wilkie, a retired K-9 officer of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department, said he came face to face with the worst of the worst. He never showed any emotion, arrogance. It was almost like, "You caught me," he seemed to say with his silence, "but you didn't stop me." His criminal history was extremely disturbing and painted a very clear picture of who he was. He had previous sex crime convictions and arrests spanning across almost 4 decades, and had been on Florida's Registry of Sexual Offenders since it was created in 2007. The criminal profile of Donald James Smith. For nearly 4 decades, Donald James Smith had walked freely among society, blending in, hiding in plain sight while carrying the depravity of a man long lost to darkness. His rap sheet was not simply long, it was a chronicle of escalating violence, sexual deviance, and systemic failure. To those who study predators, his history didn't suggest he might re-offend at all, but guaranteed it. Donald's journey into depravity began alarmingly early. According to Dr. Kino, a forensic psychologist, Donald had already developed voyeuristic tendencies by the age of 10. From peeping, his behavior evolved, deepened, and became more violent with time. Donald himself claimed he had been sexually abused as a child, and that his brain was abnormal, statements that, while perhaps true, did little to justify the monstrosities he would commit. Dr. Kino diagnosed Donald with what is known as orbitofrontal syndrome, a neurological condition linked to the inability to control impulses. Hypersexuality, poor decision-making, and recidivism. The condition is rare, and in Donald's case, it manifested in the most terrifying ways. He has poor judgment. He cannot control inappropriate impulses. Dr. Kino explained. But saying he can't control them at all, that's too strong. I'm unable to say that. Still, the warning signs were clear. Donald's criminal history dates back to 1977, when he was first convicted of sexually assaulting a child under the age of 16. It was just the beginning. 1992, he was convicted of attempted kidnapping after trying to lure two teenage girls into his van, the very same method he would later use on Cherish. 2009, he called a 10-year-old girl named Christina and made obscene, sexual comments, pretending to be a social worker from Florida's Department of Children and Families to gain access to her home. He served only 14 months in jail for that incident. It wasn't a felony, so under state law, he was not reevaluated for further civil commitment. That loophole, one technicality, likely cost Cherish her life. In 1999, as Donald's prison sentence neared its end, the state of Florida and psychiatric professionals flagged him as a high-risk offender, someone likely to reoffend, someone too dangerous to be released. He was recommended for civil commitment, a rare legal process reserved for the most sexually violent predators, wherein offenders are confined to a treatment facility even after serving their full sentence. But somewhere along the way, the process broke down. The jury never heard the warnings. The doctor's assessments never reached the courtroom. And Donald walked free again. By the time Cherish Perrywinkle crossed his path in 2013, Donald had been free for just 3 weeks. Daniel Monfaldi, administrator of the Sexually Violent Predator Program, later admitted, "The statute says, we're supposed to be identifying that small, extremely dangerous number of predators. Donald was that predator. But he was missed." To many in law enforcement, Donald was not a man in decline, not someone reformed or rehabilitated. He was a ticking time bomb that had never stopped ticking. "He looks like he's never stopped," said former prosecutor Rick Alexander. Anyone in law enforcement looks at this rap sheet and knows he's trouble. His file spanned over 19 pages of arrests, convictions, and suspicions, a paper trail of horror that still didn't keep him behind bars. And when Cherish disappeared, many of the officers who responded recognized his name instantly. Charlie Wilkie, the K-9 officer who helped find Cherish's body, would later say, "If he got the chance to be out on the street today, he'd be driving down the highway looking for his next victim. He was never going to stop." Donald Smith should have never had the opportunity to approach Rain Perrywinkle and her daughters that night. The system knew who he was. Psychiatrists knew. The police knew. Even state attorneys had tried to warn others, yet he still walked free. The case of Cherish Perrywinkle wasn't just the story of a predator who killed a child. It was the story of a system that failed to lock the door, despite all the warnings carved into the walls. And when that door swung open, Donald stepped through one last time. When Rain Perrywinkle was told that her daughter, Cherish, was missing, that the tiny body found lying beside a creek behind the church was hers, she collapsed. Her legs buckled, her screams echoed in the morning air, and her grief was so great that onlookers had no choice but to call an ambulance. "The mother of the child has just died. She needs emergency help right now," someone told the dispatcher. And then, Rain passed out, rushed away on a stretcher, leaving behind a nightmare no mother should have to endure. Back at the scene, while Rain lay in shock, Donald Smith was formally charged. The man who had offered to help buy clothes for her children was now being accused of kidnapping, raping, and murdering her oldest daughter. The evidence was damning: security footage, DNA, tire tracks, witness accounts, and now, the autopsy. It was clear that what happened to Cherish wasn't a moment of madness. It was planned, methodical, and unspeakably cruel. The community responded the only way it could, by grieving with her. Strangers brought flowers, food, and teddy bears to Rain's doorstep. Hundreds of mourners filled the pews at Cherish's funeral. Nearly 2,000 people signed the guest book at her wake. News outlets covered the case wall to wall, and Jacksonville became the epicenter of national heartbreak. The community responded the only way it could by grieving with her. In the days following the discovery of Cherish's body, Rain Perrywinkle's front yard transformed into a makeshift memorial. Stranger people who had never met Cherish, never met Rain arrived with bouquets of white lilies, handwritten cards, and tiny teddy bears clutching hearts. Children left behind their favorite toys. Parents wept in silence. Someone brought groceries. Someone else slipped a gift card into Rain's mailbox with a note that simply said, "You're not alone." At Cherish's funeral, hundreds of mourners packed the church pews, shoulder to shoulder, many dressed in pink and white, the colors Rain said Cherish loved most. The service was so overwhelming that local television stations aired it live, and nearly 2,000 people, neighbors, strangers, friends, even out of town well-wishers, signed the guest book at her wake. Photos of Cherish, laughing, smiling, riding her bike, were displayed next to her favorite stuffed animals. The image of her small coffin covered in flowers would remain etched in the minds of many forever. But while the city of Jacksonville mourned a little girl lost, a quieter battle was taking place behind the scenes, one that unfolded away from the cameras and the public outcry. Only weeks after the funeral, officials from the Florida Department of Children and Families, DCF, arrived at Rain's home with a decision that would rip open a second wound. Her two youngest daughters, Destiny, aged 6, and Na, aged 5, were removed from her custody. There were no allegations of abuse, no immediate signs of neglect. The agency cited concerns for the children's welfare and invoked their duty to act out of an abundance of caution. Following Cherish's abduction and death, they said it was for the girls' protection. Rain didn't fight. Not right away. She was still numb, grieving, broken, barely functioning. But when the reality set in, the fog of grief gave way to something a mother's desperation. Suddenly, Rain wasn't just mourning the child she had lost. She was now fighting for the children she still had left. Her visits with Destiny and Na were supervised, strictly limited to 2 hours every Monday. Rain would arrive early, her hands shaking, often carrying their favorite snacks or toys. And when time was up, she would watch them walk away, again and again, like saying goodbye to Cherish all over again. Meanwhile, strangers on the internet debated her worth as a mother, and people close to the family began to petition for the girls to be adopted. Even her older sister Lindsay, from Australia, who hadn't spoken to Rain in years, stepped forward to take the girls. What began as a single, unimaginable tragedy had now splintered into legal battles, family divides, and public judgment. For Rain, this wasn't just about loss anymore. It was about survival. And somewhere in the middle of it all, two little girls just wanted to go home. As Rain struggled through supervised visits, public scrutiny, and the deafening absence of her daughter, another voice stepped forward, the voice of Cherish's father, Billy. For years, Billy and Rain had been locked in a complicated custody battle, filled with disagreements and court orders. But now, in the wake of unimaginable loss, Billy broke his silence. He had stayed largely in the background as the headlines focused on Rain. But as the future of Destiny and Na hung in the balance, he felt compelled to speak. "I'm the daddy. I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to do everything I can to be their daddy." And Judge David Gooding spoke out about Rain's custody. In front of cameras, Billy spoke with raw honesty about the pain of losing Cherish and the urgency he felt to protect her sisters. He explained how the Department of Children and Families had asked him to secure a 2-bedroom apartment as part of the process to regain custody. Until then, he hoped his daughters could stay temporarily with their grandfather, a man they had known and loved their entire lives. "They've known my dad all their life, and they're comfortable with him," Billy said. "If I'm allowed to bring Na and Destiny home, I promise I'll share them with Rain. I'd never keep them from their mother." His message was clear. He wasn't trying to erase Rain. He wasn't there for revenge. He just didn't want to lose more than he already had. Especially after losing Cherish. He said quietly, "They'll never be able to get her back." but I can fight for what's left of our family." His words struck a chord with many a father desperate to hold on to what remained. A man who had once lost custody and was now being asked to step up. And he was ready to do it. While Billy's voice called for stability and compromise, Rain Perrywinkle finally spoke up, not as a victim of tragedy, but as a mother fighting to be heard. She had stayed mostly silent since Cherish's death. Her name had been dragged through news headlines, parenting forums, and public opinion. People questioned her decisions. Some blamed her entirely. Others claimed she was unfit. Petitions were being circulated to have her remaining daughters adopted out. But Rain had had enough. "Regardless of what I say, people will have their own assumptions about me anyway," she said. "But I choose to talk right now, because I realize there are so many people trying to take Destiny and gnaw away from me and adopt them out." She made it clear she would never voluntarily terminate her parental rights. "They are my children. I gave birth to them. I have raised them from day one." She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was angry. She felt betrayed. Especially by those she once trusted, including Amy Decca, a licensed social worker whose home had become a temporary placement for the girls. Rain claimed Amy used her position and proximity to Rain's family to advocate for the girls to be adopted away, even helping manage a Facebook page titled Team Destiny and Nah. Rain said it felt like a deep personal betrayal, especially since she once saw Amy as a friend. But Amy denied any wrongdoing. "I have provided no clinical services to Rain," she said. "This has been 6 years since I had any contact with her or her children. I reached Deck in a genuine attempt to offer help." The lines were drawn. Supporters on both sides emerged. Some defended Rain fiercely, including neighbors who said they had seen her with her children constantly. Rain always had those children with her. "I don't know her that well, but she is a good mother," one neighbor said. Still, Rain's world remained under scrutiny. She had lost one child to a monster. And now, she feared losing the other two to a system that had never fully believed in her. Guilty on all counts. When justice spoke without hesitation. As the trial of Donald James Smith entered its most crucial stages, the courtroom grew quiet, not from fatigue, but from tension. Everyone knew that something pivotal was coming, something that didn't come from forensic labs or crime scene photos. It came from Donald himself. The prosecution stood and introduced evidence not of what he did, but of what he said. Not under oath. Not in interrogation. But in the place he thought he was safe to speak, his jail cell. Donald Smith, unaware that he was being recorded, spoke freely with his mother and fellow inmates during the early days of his incarceration. Those conversations, captured legally under Florida law, would soon become the final nail in his coffin. As the trial of Donald James Smith entered its most crucial stages, the courtroom grew quiet not from fatigue, but from tension. Everyone knew that something pivotal was coming, something that didn't come from forensic labs or crime scene photos. It came from Donald himself. The prosecution stood and introduced evidence, not of what he did, but of what he said. Not under oath, not in interrogation, but in the place he thought he was safe to speak, his jail cell. Donald Smith, unaware that he was being recorded, spoke freely with his mother and fellow inmates during the early days of his incarceration. Those conversations, captured legally under Florida law, would soon become the final nail in his coffin. In one recorded call, Donald spoke to his mother not with fear or remorse or trembling hands, but with agitation and self-pity. "They're making me out to be some kind of monster," he said. "I was coked up and drunk. That night I wasn't thinking straight. But then parts of the truth started to come out." He admitted to, in his words, being coked up and drunk as he watched Rain trying to buy clothes, picking them up and putting them back. He told his mom that he got them into his van and described a chaotic ride to Walmart, claiming the kids were out of control. Rain was hitting them, and Rain told him about Cherish going to California the next day because of a court order. Donald claimed that shortly after arriving at the store, no more than 5 minutes, and he began to feel uncomfortable and said he wanted to distance himself from Rain and the children. He told investigators that he walked away to get food because Walmart was about to close. According to him, he didn't intend for Cherish to follow, but she kept trailing behind him even after he allegedly told her to return to her mother. He said she had attached herself to him and that her behavior made him feel afraid, especially when she began trying to climb into his van. But surveillance footage told a very different story. It clearly showed Donald staying close to Cherish throughout their time in the store, following her through aisles, crouching beside her, even interacting with her like a familiar adult. There was no sign of avoidance, no discomfort, no attempt to separate. The images revealed what Donald's words tried to conceal. He wasn't trying to get away from Cherish. He was drawing her in. Donald later told investigators that after being inside the store for just a few minutes, he began to feel uneasy and wanted to separate himself from Rain and the children. He claimed that, with Walmart about to close, he stepped away under the pretense of going to get food. He said Cherish refused to stay behind and continued to follow him, despite his repeated insistence that she go back to her mother. According to him, she had become unusually attached to him, and he admitted feeling uncomfortable, even frightened, when she allegedly tried to get into his van. But the surveillance footage told a starkly different story. Far from distancing himself, Donald was seen hovering near Cherish throughout their time in the store. He didn't try to get away. He followed her, engaged with her, waited. There were no signs of discomfort, only calculated proximity. His words painted a picture of a man overwhelmed and pursued. The cameras captured the opposite, a predator, positioning himself close to his prey. He never admitted to assaulting her, saying he wasn't attracted to young children. But he thought the only way out was to kill her. "My mind just left me," he said over and over. "All I knew was, you gotta go. You have to go. I don't care how. You've gotta go." At one point, Donald began talking to his mother about how he planned to defend himself in court. He told her his only way out was to claim mental illness, to go down the path of incompetency and psychiatric defense. Calmly, almost as if discussing a homework assignment, he asked her to buy him a book on psychiatric disorders. It was a clear sign he was preparing to fake it. But prosecutors had something he didn't know about. As the trial of Donald James Smith neared its climax, the state held back one final card, a piece of evidence so raw, so damning, that it would silence every remaining whisper of doubt. It wasn't DNA. It wasn't fingerprints. It was his own voice. Not from the call with his mother, but from a jailhouse recording, captured without his knowledge, during a series of conversations with a fellow inmate named Frank. In those late-night talks, away from the courtroom and the cameras, Donald stopped performing. He spoke honestly, casually, cruelly, and everything he said was recorded. The moment the jailhouse recordings stopped playing, a thick, heavy silence settled over the courtroom like a curtain being drawn across a stage. What they had just heard wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. It was something worsey, an unguarded glimpse into the mind of a predator, speaking freely when he thought no one was listening. His tone had been calm, casual, almost amused. He spoke not as someone haunted by guilt, but as someone strategizing his way through the legal system, as if he were merely playing a game. "I don't view children as sexual objects. I view them as sexual partners. All I know is I snapped. They'll never believe I blacked out. I gotta go with mental illness." Each line hit like a hammer. Even in a case already saturated with horror, these recordings were something else entirely. They weren't evidence, they were a reckoning. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just confronting what Donald Smith had done. They were being asked to see who he really was and to make peace with the fact that such a man existed. Several jurors sat still, pale and stunned, hands clenched in their laps. One juror dabbed at her eye with a tissue, unable to look at the defense table. Another kept their gaze fixed on the floor, as if the audio had physically weighed them down. Rain Perrywinkle sat motionless in the gallery, her expression drained. She didn't cry. Not this time. Her grief had gone somewhere deeper past tears, past rage, into the quiet space where only mothers who've buried their children can go. On the defense side, Donald Smith sat still, blank-faced, as if none of it applied to him. As if the words on the recording weren't his. There was no protest, no emotion, just silence. And then, it was time. The judge turned to the jury, his tone measured but solemn, a tone that the gravity of what had just unfolded. Finally, early February 14, 2018, in Duval County Court, Jacksonville, Florida, the courtroom was silent when the state called its first witness. Rain Perrywinkle, Donald's defense attorney, said to the jury that Rain made poor decisions getting into the van in the first place and said she would cross-examine her. But after her testimony, Donald, for whatever reason, told his attorneys not to go ahead with the cross-examination. The state called several people, including the witness who tipped off the police about his van and Officer Charles Wilkie. The prosecution next called Dr. Valerie Ryo, the medical examiner who had conducted Cherish Perrywinkle's autopsy. As part of her testimony, 26 graphic photographs detailing the child's injuries were submitted into evidence, each one more harrowing than the last. As Dr. Rao began walking the jury through the trauma inflicted on Cherish's body, her voice began to falter. The clinical precision with which she had started gave way to visible emotional strain. When the images reached the worst of the internal injuries, she paused, shook her head, and quietly asked the judge for a 5-minute break. The courtroom was silent, but the reaction was written on every face. Jurors shifted in their seats, some visibly disturbed, one wiping away a tear. Even seasoned legal professionals stared at the monitors with clenched jaws and furrowed brows. It was clear. What had been done to Cherish wasn't just brutal, it was unbearable to even describe. Donald Smith's defense team rested their case with calling a single witness or delivering a closing statement. It was a striking and controversial choice, one that left the courtroom silent and many observers stunned. Among them was trial attorney Catherine Smith, who had closely followed the proceedings. She criticized the defense's strategy as tone-deaf and profoundly out of touch, especially in a case where the emotional weight was already overwhelming. Blaming Rain Perrywinkle, she said, didn't absolve their client of anything. It didn't make the evidence disappear. It didn't undo the trauma. It certainly didn't bring Cherish back. The facts remained: Donald James Smith had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered an 8-year-old child. No legal maneuver could erase that. After only 19 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Donald Smith was guilty on all counts: kidnapping a child under 13, sexual battery of a victim under 12, and first-degree murder. Their decision went even further. In a special verdict, the jury determined that the killing had been both premeditated and committed during the course of other felonies, namely, the kidnapping and sexual assault of Cherish Perrywinkle. It was a damning conclusion that laid the foundation for the harshest possible sentence. Now the trial shifted focus. The question was no longer about guilt, it was about punishment. And under Florida law, the options were clear: life in prison without parole or the death penalty. The sentencing phase began, and more witnesses were called as both sides presented arguments for and against capital punishment. Among them was a woman named Karan, whose testimony cast a long, chilling shadow over the courtroom. Years earlier, she had narrowly escaped an attempted abduction by Smith when she was just 13. The terror of that night still haunted her. Donald Smith was formally sentenced to death. In delivering the final judgment, the judge looked him in the eye and spoke with unwavering gravity. "Donald Smith, you have not only surrendered your right to live among decent people, you have surrendered your right to live at all. May God have mercy on your soul." For Rain Perrywinkle and Billy, Cherish's father, the sentence brought a measure of closure but not healing. It was a necessary verdict, a long-awaited reckoning. Still, no punishment could ever truly equal what had been taken from them. No ruling, no words, not even death, could fill the void Cherish left behind. Following the sentencing, Donald James Smith was processed and transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford, one of the oldest and most fortified prison facilities in the state. There, he was assigned a single-man cell on death row, locked away 23 hours a day under constant surveillance. His meals were slid through a slot in the door. He was allowed no physical contact with other inmates, and no more chances to move freely among society. But even with the sentence pronounced, and the public ready to close the chapter, the wheels of the justice system turned slowly. By Florida law, every death sentence triggers an automatic appeal. Smith's defense team, though publicly silent during the final days of trial, filed for review. They questioned whether the jailhouse recordings should have been admitted. They raised concerns about jury instructions. They suggested Smith's mental health history may not have been properly considered. But the facts were against them. Overwhelmingly so. There were no new revelations, no hidden evidence, no misconduct. The Florida Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Federal courts began preparing for what would likely be years of procedural appeals. But the outcome, everyone knew, was unlikely to change. In that sense, Donald Smith was already serving his sentence. He just hadn't died yet. As the media coverage of the trial faded from headlines, the real legacy of the case began to take shape, just in the punishment of one man, but in the damning reflection it cast on the system that had allowed him to act. Donald James Smith was no stranger to law enforcement. He had been arrested multiple times for crimes involving children, including attempted abduction, lewd conduct, and possession of child sexual purposes. He had served prison time, been placed on the Florida Sexual Offender Registry, and had been evaluated by professionals who deemed him at high risk to reoffend. Yet somehow, despite all the red flags, all the warnings, he was released back into the community just 3 weeks before Cherish was killed. That fact became the rallying cry for legislators, child advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens. How many signs had the state ignored? How could a man with a known history of predatory behavior be allowed to walk into a Dollar General, strike up a conversation with a struggling mother, and walk out with her child? New bills were introduced to strengthen oversight on released sex offenders, increase the frequency of psychological evaluations, and tighten community notification protocols. For some, it felt like progress. For others, especially Rain, it was too little, too late. "My daughter was the price of failure," Rain said in an interview. "And no law is going to bring her back." Life after the trial was quiet, but not peaceful. For Rain Perrywinkle, the spotlight had turned away, but the shadow of grief remained fixed. In the early days following the crime, her pain was amplified by public judgment. Strangers online blamed her for trusting Donald. They questioned her decisions. Some even accused her of negligence. Few understood what it meant to be a single mother of 3, shopping with empty pockets, desperate to give her daughters something better. Fewer still understood what it meant to live every day with that one choice, the one moment you say yes to help, and lose your child because of it. Rain rarely spoke to the media after the sentencing. When she did, her voice was often calm but wary. "I still hear Cherish's laugh sometimes," she said once, in a quiet moment during a TV interview. "I just wish I could remember the last thing she said to me. I wish I had paid closer attention." Her other 2 daughters, Destiny and Na, were no longer with her. They had been placed with their older half-sister Lindsay in Australia, under the care of Child Protection Services. Rain lost custody shortly after the murder, out of what the agency described as an abundance of caution. Supervised visits had turned into distant communication. Eventually, the girls stopped asking when they would see their mother again. Rain lived alone in Jacksonville. She visited Cherish's grave on birthdays and anniversaries. And some nights, she left the porch light on, "in case she finds her way home," she once said. The community never forgot the image of Cherish's bright smile, pink dress, long brown hair. Her story lingered in the minds of parents, teachers, and police officers across the country. For months after the trial, the Walmart where she disappeared saw a spike in security. More parents refused help from strangers. Schools re-upped their stranger danger training. Something had changed. And still, Donald Smith sat in his cell, day after day, untouched by time. He did not speak publicly. He gave no interviews. There was no apology, no confession, no remorse. Some say that silence is its own kind of cruelty. It would be easy to believe that the case of Cherish Perrywinkle ended the day Donald James Smith was sentenced to death. But for those who knew her, loved her, or even just followed the case, there is no ending, only a long, cold silence where a child's voice used to be. The justice system had done its job. The jury had spoken. A man who preyed on the vulnerable had been condemned. And yet, the damage could not be undone. For every moment of justice, there were years of grief. For every answer, 1,000 questions. And for Rain Perrywinkle, the mother who had trusted the wrong man, who had looked away for only a moment, there would never be another moment that didn't carry the weight of that night. He took her, Rain once said. And he took me with her. Donald James Smith remains on Florida's death row, awaiting execution. But the sentence, in truth, was never about him. It was about Cherish. And the world that failed to protect her. Legal legacy. What Cherish's death changed. The murder of 8-year-old Cherish Perrywinkle did more than shatter a family. It shattered public trust in the system, meant to protect children. After Donald James Smith was sentenced to death in 2018, the courtroom may have quieted, but the outcry beyond its walls had only begun. People weren't just angry about what happened. They were furious that it was allowed to happen. Donald Smith was not an unknown predator. He had been arrested multiple times over 4 decades for crimes involving children, from attempted abduction to lewd behavior to impersonating a child welfare worker. He had been evaluated by mental health professionals as a high-risk offender. And yet, in June 2013, he was a free man, newly released from just 21 days before he lured Cherish away. He was on probation. He was on the sex offender registry. And still, he was able to walk into a Dollar General, charm a desperate mother, and disappear into the night with her child. The case sparked outrage throughout Florida. Legislators, prosecutors, and parents alike demanded answers. How had a man with such an extensive, well-documented history slipped through the cracks so easily? In response, lawmakers proposed new bills aimed at strengthening the post-release monitoring of sex offenders. These included expanding civil commitment programs to hold sexually violent predators indefinitely, increasing real-time GPS tracking with automatic alerts to law enforcement, and tightening mandatory sentencing laws to eliminate leniency for repeat offenders against minors. There were also proposals to overhaul Florida's sex offender registry, making it more transparent, more accessible, and more honest about the true threat certain individuals posed. Beyond legislative action, Cherish's case quickly became part of legal education. It was taught in law schools and discussed in criminal justice seminars as a case study in systemic failure, how warning signs were ignored, how risk assessments went unheeded, and how bureaucracy allowed a predator to strike again. Legal journals cited the case when arguing for stricter, preventive detention laws and more comprehensive post-incarceration review boards for violent offenders. Other states took notice, too. Georgia, North Carolina, and California revisited their own policies around sexual offender monitoring, parole review, and child endangerment laws. At the federal level, discussions around enforcing and updating the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act gained renewed attention. But even with all the proposed reforms, critics said the changes didn't go far enough. Some bills stalled due to political resistance or budget concerns. Civil rights groups raised concerns about indefinite detention without new charges. Meanwhile, child advocates argued that the system continued to prioritize paperwork over protection. A registry, they said, might inform, but it didn't prevent it. And it certainly didn't save Cherish. To this day, Donald Smith sits on death row, his appeals winding slowly through the courts. But the greater impact of his actions plays out not inside a prison cell, but in policy debates, legal reforms, and the haunted caution of parents everywhere. The law may have punished one man, but it also had to face itself. Cherish Perrywinkle's death did not just demand justice, it demanded change. And while that change may be slow, incomplete, and imperfect, it remains her final legacy, a wake-up call written in pain and etched into the law by the memory of an 8-year-old girl who should have been safe. In the years that followed Cherish Perrywinkle's murder, the headlines faded. Courtrooms emptied. The name Donald James Smith slowly disappeared from nightly news tickers. But in Jacksonville, and in the hearts of millions who had followed the case, the story never truly ended. The loss of Cherish wasn't just a private trauma for her family. It became a collective wound, something that pierced deeper than grief. It pierced trust, safety, the illusion that the world was still predictable, that monsters came with warning labels. For many, especially parents, that illusion died with her. In the immediate aftermath, parenting in Florida changed overnight. Strangers at the grocery store weren't just strangers anymore. They were potential threats. Walmart employees were retrained to monitor adults who lingered near unaccompanied children. Local police departments reissued public reminders about stranger danger. PTA meetings started including guest speakers from victim advocacy groups. Some schools added emergency alerts and revised field trip protocols. For the parents of Jacksonville, Cherish's name became a verb, a warning, a lesson whispered from mother to daughter at bedtime. Don't talk to anyone you don't know. Remember Cherish. Her face, smiling and framed in soft curls, was etched onto posters, prayer cards, and Facebook profile pictures across the state. But what lingered long after those images faded was something harder to name, a paranoia that didn't fully go away. Even years later, mothers at playgrounds would glance twice at men sitting alone on benches. Fathers no longer waited in the car while their kids ran into stores. Freedom shrank, vigilance ballooned. For Rain Perrywinkle, Cherish's mother, the loss did not end with the grave or the courtroom. In the eyes of the public, she was not just a grieving mother, she was also a target. Keyboard critics called her careless. Headlines asked if she had trusted too easily. Comment sections buzzed with judgment. How could she let her daughter go with a stranger? What those critics never saw were the rent notices Rain had ignored that month. The fridge that sat empty. The dreams of buying one nice dress for her daughter. They didn't see the calculations of a struggling woman offered help by a man who seemed harmless, well-spoken, generous. They didn't see her strength, just her mistake. That mistake became a public spectacle. For a long time, Rain couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Some hugged her. Others stared. A few whispered. She once said, "People look at me like I killed my own child." She lost more than Cherish. She lost custody of her other daughters. She lost her privacy, her dignity, even her neighborhood. Eventually, Rain left Jacksonville. Where she went, she didn't tell many. Maybe nowhere felt like home anymore. Jacksonville itself changed. The Walmart where Cherish was last seen alive added more cameras, better lighting, and security patrols. That didn't stop the whispers in the aisles. No one walked out with a child anymore without holding their hand tight. The tree under which Cherish's body was found became a place of mourning, and later, quiet maintenance by city workers who trimmed back the grass every month and left the area tidy, though few spoke of it aloud. A bench. Something to mark the spot. But no one could agree. Maybe silence was the only memorial that fit. Churches held vigils. Community organizers held forums on child protection. News crews on, but every June, like clockwork, the anniversary came back, and with it the grief. Online, the case ignited a firestorm of debate that never really ended. True crime forums broke down the timelines second by second. Armchair analysts argued over what Rain should have done differently. Supporters of the death penalty pointed to Donald's case as justification for its existence. Abolitionists, though rare in this discussion, questioned whether execution would bring true justice. In Facebook groups and subreddits, Cherish's name became a symbol. Some used it to fuel calls for stronger child protection laws. Others twisted it into clickbait headlines. A few advocates, sincerely and with grace, worked to keep her memory alive by organizing donation drives and self-defense programs for at-risk youth. But like all things on the internet, compassion often came second to outrage. One tweet went viral for stating, "This wasn't just a murder. This was proof that the system doesn't care about poor kids. If Cherish had been rich, she'd still be alive." That idea struck a chord. And not just online. The Cherish Perrywinkle case, at its core, was not just about a man who committed an unthinkable act. It was also about poverty, desperation, and how predators exploit both. Rain didn't say yes to a stranger because she was naive. She said yes because no one else had helped her. The man who offered her food for her children knew that. In this sense, the case triggered larger conversations about economic vulnerability and exploitation. Local nonprofits reported an increase in donations to single mother shelters and children's mental health programs in the months after the verdict. But long-term change was harder to measure. A psychologist who worked with grieving families put it bluntly. Rain's biggest mistake was being poor in public. And predators know exactly where to find people like her. In the years since, Cherish's story has been the subject of documentaries, podcasts, legal seminars, and college ethics classes. Her face appears in montages about America's most shocking crimes. Her name is listed in articles about the failures of sex offender tracking. And while the criminal justice system punished the man responsible, the cultural reckoning remains incomplete. Because even though Donald Smith is on death row, even though the jury spoke loudly and clearly, the society that failed Cherish still has work to do. Cherish Perrywinkle became more than a victim. She became a mirror, one that showed us the cracks we hadn't wanted to see. The silence that remains a farewell and a warning. Years have passed since the night Cherish Perrywinkle disappeared from a Walmart parking lot in Jacksonville, Florida. Since her name first flashed across TV screens and newspaper headlines. Since the world first saw her school photos, and the smiling girl in a pink dress became something else, a symbol of innocence lost, and a failure too painful to ignore. The man who took her is still alive, awaiting execution in a death row cell, alone with his thoughts and the weight of the verdict against him. His name, once repeated with anger and disbelief, has faded into legal filings and court dockets. But Cherish's name remains not because justice was served, but because justice came too late. For her mother Rain, the loss cannot be measured in court dates or sentences. It lives in the quiet moments in birthdays that go uncelebrated, in the sound of laughter from other little girls, in grocery store aisles, in the ache of a memory that refuses to fade. She said once that grief is not something you recover from. You only learn how to carry it. And she carries it alone. Because, while Rain survived, she also became the cautionary tale. Judged, criticized, scrutinized. The public looked at her and saw the mother who trusted the wrong man. Few took the time to see the woman who had been exhausted, poor, and desperate, who had been offered kindness in a world that rarely gave it. What Cherish's death exposed was not only the evil of one man, but the fragility of the safety net meant to protect children like her. It revealed how easily someone with the right smile and soft voice can walk through gaps in the system, through lenient parole decisions, through overloaded probation departments, through communities unaware that danger lives next door. But perhaps the most difficult truth is this: we weren't prepared for how familiar Donald Smith looked. He wasn't the stranger lurking in shadows or the monster from cautionary bedtime stories. He was the man who offered help, who smiled, who waited, who knew exactly what to say. And so we are left with the uncomfortable reality that we didn't fail because we weren't watching. We failed because we weren't expecting it from him. In that way, Cherish's death didn't just take a child from her family. It shook the foundation of how we think about safety, danger, and trust. It reminded us that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wait in plain sight. And sometimes they speak kindly before they strike. Today, Cherish's name lives on in proposed laws, in community initiatives, in whispered prayers at candlelight vigils. But that's not enough. If her story is to mean something beyond tragedy, it must also be a warning, a reckoning, a demand that we do better, that we listen when survivors speak, that we fund systems that protect the vulnerable, that we teach our children not just to fear strangers, but to recognize manipulation, to trust their instincts, and to know they deserve to be safe. Cherish Perrywinkle was 8 years old. She loved riding her bike. She liked coloring. She wanted a new dress. And she should still be here. So tonight, if you light a candle for her, let it not only be in memory, let it burn with purpose. Let it light the corners where silence hides danger. Let it remind us of every child still trusting, still hoping, still vulnerable in a world that doesn't always deserve their faith. Because the truth is this: justice is not what happens after the fact. Justice is what we build beforehand, brick by brick, safeguard by safeguard, so that no more children have to become names carved into plaques or headlines on evening news. Cherish Perrywinkle should have grown up. Instead, she became the girl who taught us how badly we had failed. The question that remains is not whether Donald Smith will die behind prison walls. The question is, what will we do with what she left behind? That answer is still being written. And it is being written by us all. Cherish Lily Perrywinkle was 8 years old. She was not a headline, not a case file, not a symbol. She was a daughter, a sister, a little girl who wanted a new dress. Her story is one that never should have been told, because in a just world, she would still be here to tell it herself. We cannot rewrite what happened, but we can choose what happens next. To remember her is not enough. We must protect those like her. We must question the systems that failed her, and we must never look away again. For Cherish, for every child, for the future they still deserve.